and they provide like transport operations for troops. So if we want to put a lot of troops into Iraq or Afghanistan, one of the routes that they would go through is Kuwait. If we want to airlift a lot of troop supplies to Afghanistan, most of that airlift would come from our Air Force base in Turkey, or one of our Air Force bases in Turkey. Okay, he also specifies a couple of things. This is a footnote of the article, which actually makes this quite a bit broader. He says, overseas presence includes exercises and training of U.S. forces with those friends and allies, unilateral training by U.S. forces, U.S. C3I systems, that stands for Command, Control, Communication, and Intelligence, so it's basically a part of the intelligence section of what I've already talked about. He says it includes arrangements for access by U.S. forces to facilities overseas, visits to ports and airfields by U.S. naval and air forces, public shows by demonstration teams such as Thunderbirds, and a host of public affairs activities, including military musical groups, exchanges of military people between U.S. friends and allies, military training of foreign personnel in the U.S. and in the home countries, and foreign military sales and funding, and co-production of military equipment with other nations. So this is, what we have is already a broad list. This adds a lot of other things to it. And from my reading, everything that has been described, with the exception of the very last thing, is probably talked about by most other people that talk about U.S. presence, which means, in my opinion, these are, this is the core of the topic, including military musical groups, because it's an action that demonstrates the U.S. commitment to other countries, for example. So what does this include? Military-to-military contacts. So we will send our military over to another country just to train them about how the U.S. military works. We might train them in human rights training, about civil-military relations, ways to control the military by civilians. That's what civil-military relations means. There are other definitions that include drug interdiction explicitly. In Afghanistan, the military is engaged in a drug interdiction effort. Probably removing that drug interdiction effort is a reduction in military presence. There's some definitions that include humanitarian assistance or disaster relief. So, for example, there was a tsunami in 2004 that obliterated a lot of villages in Southeast Asia and killed a lot of people. The military responded to that. This particular definition that I read says that one-time crisis response is probably not an example of military presence, but there are a lot of other definitions that do include that. And then last, and the controversial part, is whether or not it includes arms sales and co-production of U.S. military equipment. Co-production just means that we train other militaries to build military assets of their own using U.S. military technology. An example of this might be ballistic missile defense to Japan. The U.S., since the 1980s, has worked with Japan jointly to build missile defense capabilities, and arguably eliminating that co-production of missile defense is possibly a reduction in U.S. military presence. There are at least qualified people that say it is, and I have not really come across good evidence that suggests otherwise. So advantages of this particular interpretation. It is the most qualified interpretation. Military presence is just the things that the military does within another country, excluding combat. It does provide a reasonable limit on the topic in the sense that a lot of the particular combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq are probably not considered military presence. But the disadvantage to this interpretation is that it is otherwise very, very broad. So if the negative has to prepare for military musical groups to each country, those might be very small affirmatives, but they also probably don't link to very much for the negative, and makes the topic very difficult to prepare for. So the third way that I would say you could maybe define military presence is at military activities that are linked to particular objectives or goals of the U.S. military. So, the second interpretation that I gave you just says military presence is anything the military does in a particular country. The third interpretation says that it is anything that the military does as long as it is linked to a particular goal. Definitions of this are very hard to come by. I actually get the feeling that a lot of people agree with this interpretation, but actual quality evidence on this question is very difficult. But we do, the military does call certain activities presence missions, as opposed to other activities that occur within a particular country. The best card that I've found on this argument so far, which in my opinion is like a C- card at best, is what I'll read for you. This is from an Army lieutenant colonel. He says, I developed the following definition of forward presence. And forward presence is used interchangeably with military presence. There are explicit definitions that equate the two. Forward presence just means U.S. military forces that are deployed overseas, which in the context of this topic, forward presence and military presence are the same thing. So he says, I developed the following definition of forward presence. The visible employment of U.S. military personnel and or military material as a deterrent outside the continental United States at any point along the operational continuum short of involving major U.S. conventional forces in combat. The controversial aspect of my definition lies in the terms deterrent and visible. Visibility is inextricably linked to deterrence. Visible to whom? To those who we wish to deter. Target audience is the key to the concept of visibility. An invisible presence is both contradictory and serves no useful deterrent purpose, which goes to the heart of the issue. Deterrence is the ultimate purpose of forward presence. So he suggests that in order for something to be presence, to qualify as presence, it has to be visible to an adversary that we are trying to deter. So for example, we have 30,000 troops in South Korea. Those are visible to North Korea. We are using those to deter North Korea. Deterrence just means that we have demonstrated that the consequences of particular actions have unacceptably high costs. If North Korea invades South Korea, then they will inevitably draw in U.S. troops. The U.S. will send in, its military from around the world and annihilate North Korea and occupy it. That cost is unacceptably high to North Korea, which means it serves as a deterrent to them. Now, what does this exclude? It probably means that things like military musical groups, for example, are arguably not presence activities under this particular interpretation, because they don't actually necessarily serve to deter another country. They don't demonstrate that the cost of invading a country is unacceptably high. So that is definitely one definition of it, that it has to be both visible and kind of linked to an explicit goal of deterrence. There are other cards that support this particular interpretation, and it is definitely a more limiting interpretation for the negative, that it reduces what the negative can expect to prepare for on this topic is anything that reduces the deterrent capability of U.S. military forces in another country is potentially a reduction in military presence and links to any disadvantage that says that it compromises the deterrence of the United States and increases the risk that another country might attack them. The point of this last interpretation is to reinforce a particular concept, is that presence is more political than it is military. Military presence is more political than it is military. Military presence, the goal of deterrence, is a political goal that says that North Korea, you better not get out of line. Arguably, there are other political goals associated with U.S. presence. So another big reason we have U.S. troops in South Korea, for example, is reassurance. There's a political goal that the South Korean government feels